Welcome everybody. Tonight we are talking about I've called ancient practical spirituality. So I'm president of the Orthodox Christian Fellowship on campus. I'm an Eastern Orthodox myself, and a Father Timothy from one of our local churches. And then we have with us also tonight a bunch of members of the Newman Club. So thank you. And that's the group for Catholic students. And so we decided to co-sponsor an event on some ancient traditions of spirituality and what does that mean for us who have spiritual lives today. So what's motivating this basically is that all of us struggle with one type of sin or another. Come on in. Struggle with one type of sin or another, and something that just hinders our lives and prevents us from living an abundant life. And we're often told, if you just convert to Christianity, you will be free from sin. Jesus will take your sins, you will be free, you will have this abundant life of Christ in you. And what's very often happens is people go through these conversion experiences, and it's amazing, your life is wonderful, you dedicate yourself to Christ, and then you leave whatever camp or Bible you're at, and you're still on this high for a little while, but a few weeks later it starts to drop off, and then the habitual sins that used to get you before start to come back up, and you slip back into this pattern of just surviving, and you end up not getting what you were promised. But then you go to church on Sunday to tell you, you just need to believe hard enough. And so you try to believe hard enough, and it doesn't exactly work. And they say, well, read your Bible. And you read your Bible every day, but it doesn't solve everything. And they tell you, well, you get baptized in the Spirit. And so you go and get baptized in the Spirit. And it's a wonderful, ecstatic experience. But then it wears off. And so you have to do it again every Sunday. And what ends up happening is you're told over and over again that you're going to have this awesome spiritual life and be free and live abundantly. And then it's a lot harder than that. And this isn't just in the Christian, I've just given, where it's manifesting in Christianity, but it also happens in secular life. Self-help books are off the charts right now, and everyone wants to live this life, but for whatever reason, we keep sabotaging ourselves and screwing things up for us, and we're our own worst enemies when it comes to living a good life. But the Christianity's been around for 2,000 years, which means this isn't, 20th century we just discovered this. This is obviously we've been struggling against human nature since the beginning. And within the Orthodox tradition, the Catholic tradition as well, there's a very well-developed way to deal with all these things. And attitudes towards sin and getting free from all of this and having a spiritual life. The problem is that we've mostly forgotten all of this and we don't practice those things. So today, the question is, so all these things we've been told don't work, and we're still struggling against ourselves, so what does work? And my answer is the ancient method has been tried and tested for 2,000 years, and people messed up a bunch by trial and error or by divine revelation have figured out the way that spirituality works. And they've presented to us and saved us in the church. So one thing I should clarify with is, in the Orthodox tradition, we don't view sin as like, you're a bad, naughty person for having committed these sins. Sin is much more like a sickness that you suffer from. And if you see someone who's caught in a sin, it's not like you should be angry at them or condemn them or something. It's they need healing. They need someone to show them the way to get out of this. They need medicine. And so today I'll be talking about the kind of spiritual medicine we get in spiritual practice and spiritual life. So let me start with the specifics of specific sins and what they do and how it all works out. And then I'll get back to the more general framework of the context of spiritual life. So we'll start with something concrete to talk about and go out from there. So to do that, let's talk about the 7 deadly sins. Now, these are very well known in the Catholic Church, talk about the 7 deadly sins. In the Orthodox Church, we don't usually talk about, there's exactly 7 of these and, 4 cardinal virtues and 3 theological, divided up that way. But I'm getting this, my presentation from an Orthodox writer, so we still think about 7 deadly sins. And everyone knows that the root of all sin is pride. If you've ever, paid attention in catechism, that's what you would learn. Or if you've read C.S. Lewis, he says the root of all sin is pride, and it's like the chief sin. So let me put that on the board. Pride. Now, what is pride exactly? We often think of pride as thinking about yourself better than other people, but I've also heard pride is thinking about yourself better than others, thinking about yourself worse than others, and thinking about yourself about the same as others. The problem is really thinking about yourself too much. And more sinister than that, the problem with pride is that it like obfuscates things. It makes them blurry, confusing. And the word in the Orthodox Church for this is prelest, where prelest is in some sense the root of all sin. And what prelest is this kind of confusion. And I worked at a homeless shelter this summer, all summer, and we had an Orthodox homeless shelter. And we talked about these things and used these things to work with people who had drug addictions and alcohol addictions. And not just addictions, but also mental struggles and bad home life and things like that. And I can just tell you from experience, prelest is the root of all sin. And if you just examine yourself, you realize there are things that you don't want to admit about yourself. Truths that are very difficult, the deep, dark places of ourselves, that if we really were to admit about ourselves would be very troubling. And so we try to create this false image or comforting image of who I am. And we say that that's the truth about ourselves. But that misunderstanding of self, misrepresentation, is what leads to, us getting angry at someone or anything else. All of our other sins. And because we don't have a good view of ourselves and don't face the honest truth, we end up sabotaging ourselves. And there's a part of me that thinks I'm this way, but I'm really this other way, and so I don't address the problem. And that's why I keep sabotaging myself. Another way to think about pride is it's the love of eminence. So again, this love of, I'm not that thing that I don't want to admit. I'm eminent. I'm better than all of this. And what would love of eminence give rise to? Well, love of eminence would give rise to two things. If you're eminent, you want to be comfortable. You want to be happy. You deserve happiness. You deserve comfort. You also want to have power, and you want to have things. So we call the love of comfort gluttony, and the love of power greed. And it's easy to see how these two work. Obviously, you want to be comfortable. You're going to want to indulge. And if you want to have power and have things, you'll be greedy for them. And when I worked at the homeless shelter, one question was, well, can you be greedy if you're homeless and poor? And the answer is yes. What we served a bunch of meals where people came in and sat down and ate the meals. And one thing you'd often heard is, no, that's my chair. I was sitting there. Or that was my fork. So they're greedy and they want this thing. This is my position. I should be here. This belongs to me. This ownership thing. And that greed manifested even in poverty. And the same thing for gluttony. Even if you're starving to death, you can have a desire to indulge and to overindulge. And what do these two give rise to? Well, what happens if someone takes your chair and you don't want them to take your chair? Well, one, you're angry, and you might fight, and we almost had a bunch of fights this summer. And the other, envy. If you don't fight them and you let them have the chair, well, you'd be pretty envious of that. You wanted that chair. And you can see how, if you go down this path and you're here and you're angry and envious, you're not going to be very happy. You basically self-sabotage. Instead of sitting and enjoying your meal, you're now upset about somebody who did something really like, does it really matter what you said? No. But we work ourselves up into this because we think we're entitled and all of that. And what does gluttony lead to? Well, two things. If you want to indulge, if you want comfort, well then you'll lust for comfort. And if you also want comfort, you might feel slothful. Now, when we think of lust, we often think of sexual lust, and that is a big part of it for a lot of people. But you can lust for other things. You can lust for any kind of comfort, really. And this is just the indulging in it. And then sloth, the way this actually translates is not so much sloth, but what they call faint-heartedness. So this is much more like depression or just feeling like so weak and so overpowered by everything that's going on around you that just, I can't deal with this. I just need to lay and just, I can't engage at all. And this is because there's this desire for comfort, that we just need comfort somehow, and the world out there is too hard, so I'm just going to give up. And these things can manifest in all sorts of ways. You could lust after, or gluttony. Gluttony could manifest when you watch too much TV. You just want to overindulge in this, or that could be almost an extension of the sloth. I can't deal with this, so I'm just deal with the thoughts that are going on and the problems in my life, so I'm just going to sit down and escape it and watching TV. Or skim through the internet, use social media all the time, text my friends constantly, jump from one relationship to another. I can't be happy unless I'm with someone. We need something out there to comfort. You're addicted to things, to objects, and your happiness is dependent upon them. And on the other side here, this is the same kind of addiction to objects displacing your happiness, only this time your happiness is dependent upon like some kind of power or a social relationship. So one thing that a lot of psychologists have noted about culture today is that it's a very codependent culture, where our attitude, or like my idea of being happy means these other people have to treat me right. If they don't, I'm going to be upset at them. I'm going to be angry, I'm going to be envious, where I have to have the best car, the best anything, and my mental state suddenly depends on everyone else's mental state. And if you really take that seriously, then you're never going to be happy, because other people, you can't just depend on others. But we do live in a very codependent culture, and this is where like gossip comes in and all these sort of things. And so one thing that emerges from all of this is that you can divide this up into 3 basic categories. And here you've got the physical manifestations of all of this stuff. This is where the inability to be happy and to be content and satisfied manifests by being attached to physical things and indulging in physical things. And here's the social dimension, where it's other people that you become dependent upon and codependent upon. And that's why you respond with anger or envy or greed, because it's power I want here or comfort I want. Another thing to notice is that I've put these in terms of, and this is physical, this is social. This would be like the attitude towards self and the root of all of it. Maybe the personal kind of mental habits that lead to these 2 manifestations. I also put this in terms of love of ease, love of eminence, and love of power. But you can also think about this in terms of fear instead of love. Because if someone loves ease, they're afraid of pain, they're afraid of suffering. And maybe the reason that they're grasping after these things is because they've suffered so much, and they want to satisfy the suffering, get out of this chain of suffering. And so that fear motivates them to lust or sloth or gluttony. So that way it looks like the fear is primary. But you could also think about maybe the love is primary. The reason we're so afraid of suffering is because, we love being ease, and we think that the only satisfaction there is in life is being comfortable, and there's nothing beyond that. And if that is really where we stake our salvation and stake our hope, well then, of course we're going to be afraid of the loss of that. And here, so the fear is fear of pain. Here would be the fear of powerlessness or the fear of loss. I'm afraid he's going to take my chair. I'm afraid I'm not going to have a position at this table. And so I'm going to respond by anger, or even if I don't get it, I'm just going to be really upset about it and envious of this guy. And all of those 2 fears are obviously rooted in the fear that is pride. The fear that, do I matter? Do people care about me? Does my comfort matter? Does my position matter? And this kind of more deep sort of self-identity question that a lot of people suffering from trauma get into can be the scene of the root of all this. Another way to see all of this is in Orthodox anthropology, which is the theory of man. There's 3 basic faculties of the human person. There's the will, there is the intellect, and there is the faculty of desire. So basically, I can will things and will it something to be the case. I actually act it out with my body. I can think about things and have the faculty of my mind, reason, and then I have the faculty of desiring things. And when the faculty of desiring things go wrong, I want to desire too much, or just maybe the desire not enough. And this leads us to this kind of pattern of greed, where desire gets out of its place. And the same thing with will. One thing that a lot of contemporary science has shown, which the fathers knew already, was that the willpower is like a muscle. If you don't use it, don't exercise it, then you don't have very much willpower. But if you use it too much, you'll get exhausted, and you run out of the ability to just will yourself into doing the right thing. And so whenever the will is weak, then you can either try to just completely indulge yourself and will to have pleasure, or if that's not available to you, then you just give up and say, well, I'm just going to be faint-heart now and just lay back and give up my will. And these are the 2 ways that the will can get out of this. And this is all based on the faculty of the intellect, where we've got a mistaken concept, a mistaken idea about ourselves, about how things work, about the place of my will. And what happens in gluttony is the will takes the place of the intellect. Instead of thinking rationally about what's good for me, I'm just going to indulge. Or if desire takes the place of the intellect, instead of thinking, what do I really desire? Does it really matter if I get this chair or that one? No, we just automatically go straight to desire, and there's a short circuit between thinking and acting. Now, then we have the virtues, obviously, which is just a mirror of this. So opposite, here's the 7 heavenly virtues, what they're called. So opposite anger is what they call gentleness. Opposite envy is contentment. Opposite sloth is diligence. Opposite lust is chastity. Now again, because of the way English was translated, these 4 don't exactly mean what they sound like. Chastity isn't just sexual chastity. It's just not super indulgent. And diligence isn't just working really hard. It's, having some kind of motivation, having some kind of, your will being able to be used for the right thing when it's necessary and not used for the wrong thing when it's not necessary. And the same thing with contentment. This doesn't mean, I'm poor but I'm happy, I don't really care. It means that you're not going to get caught up in these other things. And the same thing with gentleness. This attitude, it's not just the absence of anger, but a positive attitude of, I'm going to seek out the goodness of the person. Now, just like there's a 3rd tier, 2nd tier, 1st tier, so with the virtues, chastity and diligence are both fruits of what we call moderation, which is the opposite of gluttony. And contentment and gentleness are fruits that come out of a person who is generous. And now you can think about the generous. Think back to the example of the guy with the chair. Let's say someone does take your chair. Well, you can get angry at them, or you can say, "Have this chair. I want you to have this." And then suddenly, instead of being angry at them or envious or greedy about it, you're being generous towards them. You're going to give them this place that you expected to have, but that generosity now suddenly, instead of a negative emotion, you're feeling positive about this person. I love them. I'm going to care about them. I'm going to give them something that I value. And this generosity negates the anger and the envy. And obviously, these 2 are fruits of humility. And humility isn't thinking that you're a bad person. Humility is not having a mistaken view about yourself. It's not being duped into this kind of pre-lust. Humility is clarity. It's enlightenment. It's being able to think clearly about things without, if you ever talk to someone who's angry, they're not thinking clearly. And their jumps in logic don't make any sense. And it's because they get stuck down here and duped into all of this, and this takes the place of the intellect. And humility is when things are in their proper place. A word that I like better in English than humility is simplicity. And you can think about a simple person. Of course they're going to be moderate. And of course they're going to be generous. And I should say about moderation, this isn't just denying oneself extremes. Moderation is the presence of like a positive self-care. If you care about yourself, you're going to diet and exercise. And obviously that would negate lust and sloth. Or if you care about yourself, you would recognize that your mental states don't depend on these external things. It's not that the world is supposed to care about you and take care of your own well-being. You're going to have a self-care, and you're going to recognize that my mental state, my well-being, is not a function of the world. It's a function of how do I treat myself, what kind of spiritual attitudes do I develop. And this is what the fathers taught in ancient times, but also what modern psychology has revealed to be the case. And this kind of positive attitude of moderation and self-care is wonderful. Now, one thing to notice is if you've ever gone to confession or ever heard of confession, most people are at this level. When you think about things you've done wrong, I was angry, or I was envious, or I was too lustful, or I sloth. And when I've talked to priests about this, and you can contradict me, but most people confess these type of things. Very few people come in and say, well, I was full of gluttony and greed and pride, and just mention those things. More it's this kind of stuff. And then to try to combat this, we go directly down here. Well, I'm angry, so I'm going to try to be more gentle right away. But when you're angry, you don't want to calmly, talk to this person with a calm voice. No, you want to yell at them. So you can't directly negate here, because what's really going on, if you're angry or envious, is there's a root cause. Actually, there's two root causes, but there's a more immediate root cause here. And so if you're struggling with anger or envy, what do? You don't try to be gentle and content. If someone's envious, don't just tell them, be content. that will solve them. It's not practical. The practical thing is try being generous. So if you're angry at someone, try being generous with them. Try giving them your money, your time, your talent, your care, your prayer life. And this leads to the three fundamental spiritual practices of both the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. The practices of almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. So if you want to get at this root cause here, when you're struggling with something like this, well, fasting is the root cause. If you care for yourself, you'll diet and exercise and develop a positive attitude of yourself. If you're struggling with anger all the time, try getting money. Try going and volunteering at a homeless shelter, or a soup kitchen, or at an orphanage. And if you've got a bad view of yourself, if you think you're above everyone else, try praying or try going to confession. And what these do is they don't stay at this level, but they go deeper and they dig deeper and get at the root cause and address it. So if you're struggling with lust, and you're jumping from one relationship to another and are codependent on others, or codependent on some like TV or something, or you're gossiping all the time, what's a good way to handle gossip? Well, go volunteer somewhere. Be generous. What's a good way to handle a TV addiction? Fast from food. And it seems counterintuitive, but when you see what's really at the root of all of this, then it makes perfect sense. And it makes perfect sense why the church for thousands of years has been teaching these three practices, because they really get at the heart of it. And obviously the heart is a true view of self, which is why confession and prayer and really examining yourself and being in the presence of God, more than anything else, can address these. And so if you can get at one of the really heart of these issues, then you can get out of this cycle of, I keep trying to be free from my sins, but I just keep falling over and over again. Another thing to note is that the worst ones, we often think of these, lust, sloth, envy, anger, as the worst sins you could possibly commit, but they're not. These things up here, gluttony, greed, pride, are far worse. Not because it's like you're a greedy person is suddenly, a more bad person than someone who's slothful, but because this is a deeper sin. And especially having a bad view of yourself. If you've got illusions about who you are and what you're capable of, then trying to address one of these won't work, because you'll set yourself up for failure. You'll try to lift too much with your spiritual muscles, or not enough. And why having the right, honest understanding of who you are, admitting those hard things, and these three practices are more fundamental. And why you shouldn't think, just because you're committing these sins, get all caught up in it, because these can just be a distraction. And again, I would want to move away from this idea of just these kind of really big sins we commit, like murder and all of the, going out with prostitute or something is like the worst sin you commit. The worst ones are probably the small ones, the ones that become habitual, that shape this, the pre-lust, that create these patterns of self-sabotage. And I'm going to give you two examples of habitual sin that don't immediately obviously sound like habitual sin. Imagine, and again, with sin, it's not just a bad behavior, but a whole state you're suffering from. So imagine you're sitting at home and you get hungry, so you decide you're going to go out and walk to the Union. And so you go outside and you realize it's really cold, so you decide you're going to go inside and get a sweater. So you go inside and get a sweater, and then you put your sweater on, and but first you have to decide which sweater you look at, or look good in, so you choose the sweater you like, and then you go outside and realize it's too cold for that, so you go back in, and really, you're going to get your car keys. And so you jump in your car, and you're going to drive to the Union and get something to eat. But then as soon as you're in your car, it's been heating up from the sunlight, so you take your sweater off, and then you drive to the Union, and you have to decide what you want. This is perfectly normal mental life that we all experience. That's just kind of the doldrum of the day. But while you're doing all of that, what did you miss? You missed the beautiful flowers around you. You missed the sunlight streaming in. You missed, saying hi to an old friend of yours walking past you. In being caught up in all these things, you're oblivious to tons of amazing and beautiful, abundant things, and you basically just spent your time self-sabotaging, setting up, I'm going to spend my time thinking about what sweater to wear, instead of I'm going to think about or live in a way that fosters an abundant life for me and those around me. Another example. Imagine you see someone walking down the road and they're just talking to themselves very loudly and very wildly, jumping from one topic to the next. And suddenly they start singing a snippet of a song over and over again, repeating it ad nauseum, and then seeming to have a conversation with themselves, but every time something new pops up, they go and get distracted and look at that or look at this other thing. You would be worried for this person if you saw them. You might think that they've got some kind of mental illness. Well, the truth is, all of us behave like that. Only instead of doing it out loud, we do it in our heads. We repeat snippets of songs and bits of language and images, get distracted, oh, look at that. And we're infatuated with this constant conversation that we have with ourselves. And while we're doing all of that, we're ignorant of the beautiful and abundant things, these virtues of simplicity, humility, generosity, caring for others, loving God. All of these things get lost in this, I'm going to repeat this joke to myself again and again and keep laughing at it. Now, these don't seem like sins in the traditional sense, but they're obviously at the root of a lot of the troubles, because if you've habituated yourself to just respond to anything you see around you and just be completely, your thought life is or you are whatever thought pops into your head, well, that's not going to be very helpful when things get rough in your life. So that's, for me, an example of a habitual sin that's so ingrained that we forget it. We look right to it. So how does a sin become ingrained like this? Well, I'm going to give you another chart that steps back another level. The Fathers describe 6 stages to temptation. The first stage is what they call provocation. And that's a very provocative name. You can imagine being provoked by someone. Someone comes up to you and starts screaming at you. You feel provoked. They're provoking you. The second stage, what happens after you're provoked, they call a momentary disturbance. Now this name almost explains itself. Someone starts screaming at you, you're a little bit disturbed. Or imagine another example. Let's say your roommate just baked a bunch of brownies and they smell really good. You're provoked to, oh, I want these brownies. And suddenly your mental life is disturbed. And your thoughts, whatever they were on before, now it's on brownies. And that's what you want. And this faculty of desire and will start to prop up. And then the next step is what the Fathers call coupling. Now, coupling is the immediate step after you're disturbed. So the thought of brownies pops into your head, or you start to get a little bit invigorated by someone yelling at you. So you start to think, well, what do? Do I get up and eat the brownies? Do I punch this guy in the face? And in coupling, you start to toy with the thought and start to maybe enjoy toying with it. Oh, those brownies would taste good. Oh, how funny it would be to see him, flop on the floor after I hit him. We haven't committed a sin yet. You're just toying with the idea. This would be fun. But as you start to toy with it, you entertain it. It takes more and more of your thought life. And if you're like the guy who just reacts immediately to anything you see, well, you're not going to put up very much resistance. And you're going to get the fourth step, which is assent. And this is when you've decided, yep, I'm going to eat brownies. I'm going to punch this guy. And now, you might actually get prevented from doing it because on the way to get the brownies you could be, fall and die or something. But at this point, you've basically committed a sin. And that's why Jesus said, if you love or lust after a woman in heart, you've committed adultery. Because you move from now thinking about it to, I'm going to act. You've involved your will now. And this is where you'll actually commit the sin. So let's say this happens again, and there's more than one temptation in your life, or you face brownies more than once in your entire lifetime. Seems possible. If you continue reacting the same way, you'll get what they call prepossession. And what this means, basically,
two S's and two more.
All right. So prepossession, you possess the sin before you're even tempted. You prepossess it. And if you spend a great deal of time watching TV or being on Facebook or anything like that, you know that after habituating it enough, it eventually does start to shape the way your mental life works. And you'll suddenly think, oh, this would be a good status to post, or I should tweet this, or I should take a picture of this and put this on Instagram. Suddenly it just becomes automatically, you're predisposed to engage in this before the opportunity even arrives. And this is, the fathers have a word for this, and they call these little thoughts that sort of crop up and are attached to something, logis moi. And logis moi, logos means word, and moi means like little, it's a little word, a little thought. And what these are the mental residue of engaging things other than the virtues. So maybe a snippet of a song, or a painful image, or a painful memory, or something addicting will just pop into your head. And because things pop into your head all the time, they have to come from somewhere. They come from mostly our experiences, and how experiences we have shape that. And all of you have experienced logos moi. If you think about times that you've tried to fall asleep and you've been kept awake at night by the running of your brain, there are things that pop up, worries, anxieties. What did my roommate say to me? You know, did they really get this part wrong? What am I doing about this situation? Oh no, I need to study for this test. I forgot about this. And these kind of painful things that make us anxious keep us from living an abundant and happy life. And we prepossess these things. We carry them with us. And if you're like the guy who immediately responds to whatever thought pops into his head and identifies immediately with that thought, well then, you know, every time you have a logos moi, you're going to be that thought. And you're going to be another being. And you do this enough times, you get what they call a passion. And a passion is when you've engaged in this mode of being, this process enough times, it's basically become a habit, it's become an addiction. And you know this is the case, you know, I work this summer with drug addicts, alcohol addicts, and especially with alcohol addicts, this whole fasting to address these other things makes a lot of sense. You fast from alcohol, you're going to have a lot easier time dealing with this level of things. And so those are kind of big passions and addiction, but there's also other small passions that we might not be aware of, like, you know, our addiction to social media, or codependence on culture or relationships, or dependence upon the external things to make me happy. Or you can say the guy who you try to search after a sweater has a passion for just living in this role of life, ignoring all the beautiful things and abundant things, and is saying just has a passion for sliding by. And once you get to this stage, it's really bad. Because, you know, all along this way, you can maybe interrupt and you know, by the time you notice you're disturbed and you start coupling with a thought saying, no, I'm not going to engage in this, and step back and not commit that particular thing that's going to make you have the worst time. But as you get down in here, you train yourself to automatically do this. And science has actually affirmed this in the modern day. You get what they call, we have the limbic system and the amygdala, which process just our sort of natural biological needs. And we've got the frontal cortex, which is oversimplification, of course, but that is critical thinking. And one thing that happens in development is until you're like 25, 24, the myelin sheathing, which is the things that make the neurons fire faster and connect better, between this limbic system, which controls just your urges and the biological needs, and then the critical thinking part of your brain isn't fully developed, which is why every teenager is basically neurotic, because they're acting out of the limbic system, and critical thinking doesn't come in yet, and there's a biological reason. And so what happens with prepossession and passion is over and over again, you stop critically thinking about, will this be a good thing for me? Instead, you just start immediately acting on it, and your limbic system automatically takes over. So that's why whenever we smell those brownies immediately, our mouth already starts watering. Before we're even aware of the smell of brownies, our brain just subconsciously starts going, oh, I'm hungry for brownies. You might even stand up and start walking in the kitchen, not knowing why you're doing it, and then you get there like, oh, brownies, and you eat them. And it's your limbic systems took over. You've shut off the critical thinking part of your brain, and because of that, you automatically get in. So all of these steps here collapse into one another automatically when you get down to here in passion. And that's why automatically you'll just look for your sweater instead of, you know, enjoy your life. So obviously that's a problem. And that's why we need things like this to stop and think about it and not be so deluded into thinking that my automatic way of being is the right way to be, and introduce practices which suddenly say, hey, whenever this thing starts to happen, I need to introduce my frontal cortex here, engage that, start thinking critically. And that's why fasting from food might help you with lust, because now suddenly there's another neural connection built between your limbic system and your frontal cortex. And the more connections like that you build, the easier it will be to deal with things where automatically you act as a limit part of your brain. So all of this happens in another level of abstraction. And there's 3 stages to the spiritual life. And I basically just described to you the first stage. The first stage of the spiritual life is what the church calls catharsis. And this is purification from the passions, basically. And you can see how if you get into all this mode of thinking and go all the way down to passion and all of these things, you're in a bad state. And if you want to live an abundant life and be free from these things and connect to God and connect to one another, love each other, love the world, then you got to get over this somehow. So the first step is catharsis, getting over it all. And catharsis has 4 parts. The first part of catharsis is repentance. And what repentance means is basically a change of mind. You have to rethink. And the critical part is there, thinking. You got into all this because you were deceived into pride and pre-lust and into passions and this whole deceptive way of living, self-sabotaging without even being aware of it. And so you've got to admit to yourself those painful things that you've been denying. You've got to basically become diagnosed. You have to battle the pre-lust. And once you do that, then you can basically become the spiritual life. The next step is what they call nepsis. And nepsis is literally translates as like watchfulness. So it's being mindful, it's being aware, it's being watchful. And this is really a critical step. This would be, as soon as you get this kind of disturbance and this whole process going on, just observe it. See what's going on. Be watchful, be mindful of what's happening. Don't identify immediately with every thought that pops into your head. And this is the recognition that my well-being is ultimately an internal thing. It's not a function of the world. My well-being is an external thing. It's not what happens to me. It's not how other people treat me. It's not what kind of comforts are around me. My well-being is a mental state, most fundamentally. And so when I start to see the immediate jump from there to there, then I should stop and be aware of that. And if you've ever worked with anyone who has severe depression or suicidal tendencies or anything like that, you notice one of the fundamental practices that they struggle with is catastrophization, or this kind of immediate jump of, oh, I feel this, therefore my life is terrible. And what this kind of neptic watchfulness does is, think about that. Actually carry it out. Is your life actually going to, are you actually worthless just because you don't get an A on this assignment? But when we're in this state of sort of traumatic striving and struggling, we immediately make that jump. So this kind of watchfulness is key. And it's especially because what it develops is a proactive way of being rather than a reactive. You don't just react to every thought that pops in your head, to every sensation you have, but you're proactive, you're intentional about, I'm going to practice virtue. I'm going to be happy prior to whatever happens to me today. And this is another case where modern psychology has started, rediscovered the truth that Christians have been saying for centuries. Mindfulness is huge in modern psychology, and it's, they've been shown that it increases your brain matter, strengthens the connection between the limbic system, it helps with depression, helps with all kinds of addictions. I mean, it's just almost a panacea in modern psychology and psych treatment. And this is also things that have been discovered in a lot of new secular religions. There's Western Buddhism, for example, has what they call vipassana, and this was a practice that claims to be ancient, but actually was developed at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, what we call modern vipassana, and it's just this kind of mindfulness. And the same thing with yoga. Yoga, again, is called an ancient practice, but the actual modern form of yoga we know was developed in the 19th century, the 20th century. And the whole point of that is just be mindful. Be aware of your body, how it works, be aware of your breathing, the interaction between your body and breathing. And psychology has shown this is great for, victims of trauma, for example. Because when you've been traumatized, you don't feel safe in your body. But being aware of your body, being able to breathe and feel safe and feel positive, and proactively instead of reactively, is beneficial. And this is why, we step back at this level here, be a little more proactive. The third stage of catharsis is discernment. And obviously these are all interplay. As you become more discerning about I'm not immediately every thought and every temptation and every impulse I have, then you can start to identify what they are and start to work those things through. You start to be able to discern the good logos boy from the bad ones. You start to be able to discern, is my anger caused by greed, or is it caused by, what is my mistaken view of self? You become more discerning, and you become to understand yourself better, and you're better able to deal with what you're struggling with. And as you practice this process goes through the cycle over and over again. You get to the point which the fathers call apatheia, which apathy, basically. And what that means is the absence of passion. You've finally gotten over passions. Of course, this doesn't happen all at once. You improve on your passions and get a little bit better, and you can start to go back to prepossession level and slowly, in one area or another, start to overcome things. And in this process of apatheia, you eventually, they become less and less crippling to living an abundant life. And what this all makes possible is the second stage of the spiritual life, which is called phortesis. Phortesis is the enlightenment that comes after purification. So you've emptied yourself of all this bad stuff, now you got to replace it with good stuff. And there are practices associated with phortesis, which, again, feed back into these and forms the whole process you go through. And the two practices are what they call the second natural contemplation, the first natural contemplation. What this basically means is you meditate on things, and then you meditate or contemplate, is where they use contemplate, ideas. So in the second natural contemplation, you sit and you think about flowers. You sit and think about an icon. You think about the cross, a physical object. And if you've ever thought about flowers and sunshine and art long enough, you start to feel happier. And it starts to create a positive thing to replace all of this mess. And then the second, you think about ideas. You think about the love of God. You think about the beauty of nature or some more concept thing, theology. And you start to be enlightened, and you have a positive thing to replace the pre-lust that was dragging you down before. And so obviously, you can be just watchful and aware and discerning and going through all of this and start to gradually replace it with beautiful thoughts and wonderful thoughts and just sit and enjoy your breathing and sit and pick the flowers and just have a wonderful life. And as this goes on, you eventually get to the third stage, which they call theosis. So there's catharsis, phortesis, and theosis. And theosis is the unification with God, which is made possible by all this. Because we're working towards a goal. I'm not just, preaching some kind of secular, modern psychology self-help thing. The reason for all of this is to ultimately connect us with God. And that's the one thing that is left out of a lot of the kind of psychological or more Eastern New Age practice that I've alluded to, is that you get to this point and flowers is where you stop. Whereas in theosis, the whole point is to be able to be a good Christian, to love others and to love God, and to not continually self-sabotage as we're in this process. And as you get here, obviously these things are all going on, it's a big cycle. And as you start to get to this realm, and you start to think about ideas, you start to think about ideas of God, you eventually reach a point that they call hesychia, it's hard to spell, which is stillness. And you can think about the Psalm verse, be still and know that I'm God. And as you're watchful and as you're contemplative, you start to not be so reactive to everything that that's going on all around you. You're not battered by the pains and the traumas and the sufferings and the fears and all the hard things in this world. And from working with a bunch of homeless guys and people with addictions, they are just battered by that. And there's no, how do I get out of this? But as you start to calm down, as we took them into our chapel and sat in prayer and contemplation, they started to find other ways of thinking, other ways of being. And hesychia is a form of mystical contemplation where you've entered into the silence and the stillness. And one thing that I would challenge you to do is to go home and do some of these. One thing that I found very helpful is, can you be completely still for 15 minutes, not move a single muscle, just breathe in and out and pay attention to the breathing and just be still. And don't have thoughts either. Don't get all caught up in this conversation with yourself. but just try to empty yourself, your mind, your body, what fathers call kenosis, and rest in that state. And what you will find is, as you train yourself to do that, you suddenly find these things far less appealing, all the sins and the prepossession and all that, and start able to notice the flowers better, start to able to notice God better. And someone once asked Mother Teresa what she says when she prays, and she says, "Oh, nothing, I just listen." And they asked, "Well, what does God say?" And she said, "Nothing, he just listens." And that kind of state is where you're at with Hezekiah. And I know that there's very few times I've been able to try to do this and have any kind of success. It's been completely amazing. The best way to describe it is literally you're like listening to the silence. So I realize that God is all the way around us. He's in this room right now. We can be aware of him all the time, but we're miss it. And he's right there, but we look right through it. Just like you can think of silence as always with us, but there's all these little distracting sounds that fill the silence. And I like the way John Page puts it, where sound is just bubbles on the ocean of silence. So you've got these tiny little bubbles that are distracting, but beneath it, it's an infinite amount of silence that you should be hearing right now. And if you can pay attention to that absence, that silence, to what the beneath is, then you can train yourself to pay attention to the God who's always with you, who you look right through. You can hear the silence and you can see the invisible. And that's basically what happens in Hezekiah. You indwell in the silence so much that becomes way more enticing than this conversation you're tempted to have with yourself. And if you're able to live in that state, then suddenly, you're all frontal cortex by that point. Maybe not entirely, I don't know if that would work. But you get the point. And while all this seems really great and complicated, it's also very simple, because there's one single tool which the fathers recommend over and over again to make this whole process happen, that happens through all of it. And that's called the Jesus prayer. And the Jesus prayer is a prayer centered around the name Jesus, which is basically, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me." And you just repeat that. You say that phrase, "Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me," and then say it again. And what you do is you habituate yourself towards that way of being. Because what we've been doing the entire rest of our life is habituating ourselves towards self-sabotage, pre-lust, anger, envy, greed, gluttony, towards passions. And so how do you fight habitual sin? Not by just being baptized in the Spirit, not by a single conversion experience. You fight habitual sin with habitual virtue and habitual spiritual practice. And so make a habit over and over again of doing these contemplations. And if it's too hard to sit and empty your mind, which is very difficult to sit and empty your mind, then say the Jesus prayer and just focus on that prayer. And so you only have the one thought, which is just one more than empty, which is pretty good. And then say that over and over again and line it up with your breathing. So you can sit and enjoy your breathing and the sunlight on you, saying, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy." In and out. And say that over and over again. And you'll eventually be easier to be watchful, because then instead of this painful thought coming up at the end of the night when you're trying to sleep, it'll be this beautiful thought, Jesus Christ. And as you repeat it, it moves from just in your lips, just in the body, the limbic system, to being something that you finally start to understand, that becomes more intellectual and reaches all the way up to the pride. And so it starts with the lips, moves to your mind, and finally dwells in your whole spirit, in your whole body, and your whole way of being. And at that point, you've perpetuated virtue instead of sin. So, I would recommend the Jesus prayer, and I would recommend going through all of this and using it through this whole process. You can think about the flowers while using the Jesus prayer. You can be watchful. And next, I would recommend sitting and trying to commit those things to yourself that are hard, but do so under the guidance of someone who's more experienced too. That's why we have pastors and priests, because they've hopefully been through all of this and are familiar with all of it, and have tried this a bunch. And so when you're struggling and get stuck, and obviously it's hard to stand above yourself and figure out what part of yourself you're missing from yourself. And so that's why it's good to have Christian brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers to lean on. So I would encourage all of you to find someone like that. If not, I know Father Tim's always available, and try practicing things. So, any questions? Good, 5 minutes.
Would you, along with the Jesus Prayer, would you recommend any sacramental meditation or
Definitely.
meditations, like maybe thinking about the cross?
Yeah, I mean, this would be, in the Orthodox Church, we have icons. In the Catholic Church, they also have icons, and they have statues as well. And this would probably come up in this type of meditation. These are tools to help you think about positive things, because if you're filled with all these negative things you automatically think about, then you might need something external to rely on. I think, here's something positive that I can enter myself into. And if my whole way of being is dependent upon the external world, it's hard to just, all right, now I'm going to depend on myself entirely or have my well-being in here. Find positive things in the external world. So church, fellowship, sacraments, especially, icons, and that can be definitely is implicit in all of this. And there is a Buddhist monk I really like who talks about the Eucharist and how he thinks it's the most amazing thing that's ever been instituted, because with the Eucharist, Christ was teaching his disciples to be mindful. And when you take this bread and wine, don't just take it as something you just throw away, but really pay attention, really contemplate it. Don't just see it as it is, but see it not at this level, but somewhat at this level, but even here. Go all the way up. And that's a practice of mindfulness and awareness, which directly challenges the root of all of this. Any other questions? Well, if you're interested in any more, we're going to have a video of all of this you can watch again. But also, I have these charts, there's handouts. I didn't print them. But if you really want them, you can feel free to contact me. My name, my email is on the mass email we sent out. And if you want to know more, I'm always available. Father Tim's always available. And I'm sure Monsignor King's always available. And, good luck. We're all in this together. And, yeah, wish you the best.